This model shows the parts of a flower. Now this is a cutaway version. Now let's see the major parts of what is called a perfect flower, which means it has all the flower parts. Down below you have the stem, then it's attached to the receptacle, which holds all of the other flower parts. The petals, as you see here, but just below the petals are these sepals, which are the little green petals that you see below many flowers. Now these are the reproductive parts inside the flower. The pistil are the female flower parts, and the stamen are the male flower parts. Now let's see what happens here. The pistil is comprised of a stigma, which is the top portion of the pistil, then the style, and then the ovary, which inside, of course, will form the seeds when they're fertilized. The male flower parts, the stamen, comprised of the anther, which has the pollen, and the filament, which attaches it to usually the receptacle. Now in pollination, the pollen has to be transferred from the anther to the stigma. Then the pollen will then find its way down the style into the ovary to fertilize what will become the fertile seeds. And of course, the fruit also will develop in this area as well. When we think of pollination, we think of insects. Butterflies and the honeybee are two of the most common. But wind can also pollinate trees, shrubs, or flowers. Here you can see the pollen from a pine tree. Now we mentioned the perfect flower, which means that it has both male and female parts. This is an apple blossom, and yes, it is a perfect flower. The tomato blossom is also a perfect flower. It has both male and female parts. But the stamens are fused together and surround the pistil. This usually prevents insects or wind from bringing in pollen from other varieties of tomatoes. Visiting bumblebees can transfer the pollen from the anther to the stigma. However, if the bumblebees aren't present, you can do the pollinating for them, and this will increase your yield. Just every so often go out to the garden and tap the flower blossoms with your finger, and that should do it. If you want a little higher tech method for doing the same thing, buy yourself a cheap battery-powered toothbrush, and this should do it. There is one common plant in the garden that is imperfect. It has imperfect flowers. There are two different flowers on one plant, one male flower and one female flower. The top photo shows a male flower. Note the slender stem. The bottom photo shows a female flower. Note the swollen base. That will form the fruit or the squash if it is pollinated. Here you can see some insects inside a squash blossom. Now bees, for example, will rummage around in the male flower as well as the female flower and carry pollen from the male flower to the female flower on the hairs on their back and sides. Now with the decline of the honeybee and bumblebee population, some gardeners feel it may be necessary to pollinate their squash and zucchini plants by themselves. It's simply done with a paintbrush by dusting some of the pollen from the male flower onto the female flower part. Now here are some ways in which the flower helps attract pollinators. The brightly colored flowers certainly act to help attract, as well as the shape of the flower, which seems to be suited for many of the insects that come to visit. And of course, the sweet nectar that is produced is food for many of the insects, birds such as the hummingbird, and even bats. And of course, there's also the fragrance, which helps attract all of these to the flower. There are some flowers that don't smell quite that good to humans. This is called the corpse flower. It's one of the many. And they smell, of course, just like you'd think, rotted flesh. Now every 7 to 10 years, this will bloom, and it does attract visitors when they are in botanical gardens to come to smell the plant. I don't get it, but then again, people all have their ways. Now let's take a look at some photos that I took of some visitors to my garden. Well, that's about it for flowers today. Happy gardening!